I was the only human in the Interstellar Council chamber the day they voted to let the Velhari die. I still remember the exact sound the translator implant made in my ear when the votes came in. A soft chime, 47 times, one after another. 47 civilizations, some of them thousands of years older than my entire species, all choosing the same word, abstain. I sat in the back row of the chamber with my hands flat on the table. My name was Dr. Asha Marin. I was 34 years old. I had been Earth's diplomatic representative at the Conclave of Species for 3 years, and in that time I had been ignored at lunches, talked over in sessions, and gently patted on the head by ambassadors whose civilizations had been traveling between stars before my ancestors had learned to write. I was used to being underestimated, but what I heard that day was not condescension. It was something quieter and far worse. It was the sound of an entire galaxy deciding that some lives simply did not count. The Velhari were not warriors. They were not engineers or traders or political players. They were small, quiet, bioluminescent people who lived on a planet called Velshan in a gravitational corridor that nobody had ever cared much about until 6 months ago, when a survey drone from the Keth Dominion found deep veins of crystalline minerals running beneath the planet's crust. Minerals worth more than the entire GDP of a dozen mid-tier systems. The Keth had a phrase for it in their language. It translated roughly as a fortunate inconvenience. The inconvenience, of course, was the 2 million people already living there. The Keth moved quickly. They filed a legal declaration with the Conclave calling Velshan a resonance hazard zone, a technical classification so rarely used that 3 of the Conclave's own legal advisors had to look it up. It was a fiction, and everyone in the chamber knew it. But it was a legal fiction, which in interstellar politics is almost as good as the truth. Orbital bombardment began within the week, not all at once, slow and deliberate, as if the Keth wanted the galaxy to see what they were doing and understand that nobody was going to stop them. Nobody had. Until that moment. I looked around the chamber after the 47th vote came in. I looked at the Ron ambassador who was studying the ceiling. I looked at the chorus of Dial, 3 beings sharing one body who had not moved in minutes. I looked at the Varathi delegate, old as stone, who had spoken beautifully earlier about the importance of peace and the terrible cost of conflict, and had then voted to do absolutely nothing. And I thought about what I had seen in the mission briefing that morning. A Velhari village, before and after. In the before image, lights. Hundreds of small glowing figures moving through narrow streets, their bodies shimmering in blues and greens the way fireflies do in summer. In the after image, nothing. Just rock and ash and the indifferent dark of space above it. I raised my hand. The chamber went so quiet I could hear the ventilation system hum. The conclave chair, a tall angular being called Moderator Voss from the Sirith Federation, looked at me with something I could only describe as genuine surprise. Humans rarely spoke unprompted in full sessions. We were too new. We did not yet understand, as the older species liked to remind us, how things worked. Earth recognizes the floor, I said. My voice did not shake. I was proud of that. Delegate Marin, said Moderator Voss carefully. The vote has concluded. I know, I said. I am not contesting the vote. I am making a declaration of intent under Article 31 of the Conclave Charter. Earth will shelter the Velhari. There was a pause. Then, from the Keth ambassador's side of the chamber, a sound that I am fairly certain was laughter. The Keth ambassador was a broad-shouldered being named Vorath, with a face like polished granite and eyes the color of old copper. He did not bother to hide his amusement. Earth, a single system species, one warship if you were being generous, no standing allies, no military treaties, no history. Several delegates leaned toward each other and whispered. I heard fragments, young species, emotional. They do not understand the cost. Give them time. Moderator Voss spoke with practiced patience. Delegate Marin, you understand that such a declaration would put your world in direct political conflict with the Keth Dominion, a Tier 1 power with active military presence in. I understand, I said. I am making the declaration anyway. Another pause. This one felt different, heavier, as though the room itself was not sure what to do with what had just happened. Vorath stood slowly. He had the kind of stillness that very powerful beings learn when they no longer need to rush anything. Earth's declaration is noted, he said smoothly. We trust the young delegate understands the weight of gestures made before this body. He sat back down. He was already looking elsewhere. I was already irrelevant to him. A footnote. A minor irritation that would sort itself out. I gathered my documents. I did not look at the other delegates. I did not want to see their pity or their discomfort or their careful neutrality. I walked out of the chamber alone, through the long corridor that led to the docking bay, my footsteps echoing on floors that had been polished by 1,000 years of alien dignitaries who had all, presumably, known exactly what they were doing. I did not know exactly what I was doing. I had just committed my entire planet to protecting a people I had never met, against a power that could fold us economically inside of a year. I had done it on instinct, on the back of a mission briefing photograph, and on 3 years of quiet, building rage that I had apparently been saving up without realizing it. My communication device buzzed. It was my supervisor back on Earth, Director Owen Hartley, who I had not consulted before making the declaration. I let it buzz. At the end of the corridor, near the docking bay viewport, there was a Velhari child. I do not know how she had come to be there. The Velhari had no representation at the conclave. Perhaps someone had brought her as evidence. Perhaps she had come with a journalist. She was small, no taller than my waist, and her skin was the dim, flickering blue-gray of a phone screen in a dark room, not the bright, warm glow I had seen in the before photograph. This was the color of something running out of light. She had her hand pressed flat against the viewport glass. She was looking out at the stars in the direction of Velshan. I stopped. I did not say anything. I did not have words in her language. I sat down on the floor beside her so that I was at her height, and I looked out at the same patch of stars. We stayed like that for a long time. The docking bay was cold and the floor was hard and my knees would be sore later. I did not move. After a while her light shifted, just barely, from gray to the palest, faintest green. I did not know what it meant, but it was different from what it had been before. That was enough. I picked up my communication device and called Director Hartley back. "Asha," he said, and I could hear the very particular sound of a man who has just been handed a crisis and is still deciding whether to be angry or frightened. "Please tell me that what I am reading in the conclave feed is a translation error." "It is not a translation error," I said. "We need to talk about ships and doctors and how quickly we can get both to the Velshan corridor." A long silence. Then the sound of a chair moving. Then, "How many people are we talking about?" I thought of 2 million. I thought of what the after photograph looked like. I thought of a small hand pressed against glass in the dark. "However many we can save," I said. "That is how many we are talking about." He did not hang up. That was the first good sign. I held the phone to my ear and looked back at the Velhari child, and I thought about what I had just done to both our futures. I was terrified. I was also, for the first time in 3 years of careful diplomatic silence, completely awake. Outside the viewport, somewhere in the dark between the stars, the Keth fleet was still at work. We had 6 weeks. I planned to use every hour. I arrived at Velshan with 1 diplomatic frigate, a field hospital module, 4 cargo haulers that had been repurposed from Earth's emergency response fleet, and 61 volunteers who had signed up in the span of 4 days after my declaration became public. There was no fanfare at our departure. Earth's parliament was still arguing about whether what I had done was legally binding. Half the news feeds were calling me brave. The other half were calling me something I will not repeat here, though the central meaning was roughly the same as reckless and naive. I did not read the coverage. There was no time. The Keth had sent a communication to our ship before we even cleared Earth's system. It was brief and professionally polite in the way that very strong things can afford to be polite. It said that our presence in the Velshan corridor would be considered a diplomatic intrusion. It said that Earth should consider carefully the consequences of extinctions beings with no standing in conclave law. It said that Ambassador Vorath hoped my government would make wise decisions in the coming days. I filed the communication in a folder I labeled Noted and continued reviewing medical intake protocols. Lieutenant Commander Declan Ford was the senior officer on our frigate. He was 41, ex-Navy, and he had the kind of face that looked perpetually unsurprised, as though he had decided somewhere around age 30 that the world was going to do whatever it wanted, and the best you could do was stay ready. He found me in the mission briefing room 6 hours before we reached Velshan and sat down across from me without being asked. "I want to be clear about what we are flying into," he said. "Be clear," I said. "We have no combat authorization, no orders that allow us to engage a Keth vessel under any circumstances. If they decide to fire on us, we are officially a soft target." "I know. I want to make sure you know that I know that." I looked at him. "Are you asking me to turn around?" He thought about it for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm telling you my people understand the situation and they chose to be here anyway. I thought you should know that." I held that for a second. "Thank you, Declan." He nodded and left. I went back to the protocols. We reached Velshan at 034 ship time. The planet below was green-brown, ocean-heavy, with wide shallow seas that caught the light of its sun in long gold strips. It looked peaceful from orbit. It was not. 3 Keth vessels were positioned in a loose triangle above the northern continent, and as we entered sensor range I could see what they had done to the land below. The bombardment pattern was methodical, not random. They had hit the cities first, then the water infrastructure, then the agricultural zones. Whoever was directing this operation was not in a hurry. They were being thorough. I sent a hailing signal to the surface on every frequency our communications array could reach. For 11 minutes, nothing came back. Then a signal, weak, scrambled, coming from somewhere in the southern mountain range, where the terrain was too rough for efficient bombardment. A voice, then clicking sounds, then a different kind of signal entirely. Our translator implants worked on language patterns. Whatever the Velhari were sending was not primarily a spoken language. The implants caught about 40% of it, enough to understand the word for help, and the word for children, and the word for dark. I told Declan to take us down. He looked at the 3 Keth vessels on the tactical display for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, "Aye," and took us down. We found them in a cave network beneath the southern ridgeline. 14,211 people. At least that is what the first count gave us. The actual number shifted over the next 24 hours as small groups emerged from deeper caves, drawn by the sound of our generators or the smell of the food our medical team had started preparing, or simply by the light. Velhari were instinctively drawn to light, even in grief, even in fear, even when they had learned in the worst possible way that bright things could fall from the sky and destroy everything you had ever known. The first thing that struck me was how quiet they were. I had expected noise, panic, the kind of sound that comes from thousands of people who have just lost their homes and their families and their entire world. Instead, there was almost silence, a stillness that was heavier than noise. They moved slowly, close together, and their lights, which I now understood shifted with emotion the way a human face does, were almost entirely dark. Blues and greens so dim they were nearly gray. Infants pressed against the chests of adults, who barely seemed to register anything around them. Old Velhari sat against the cave walls with their hands in their laps and their eyes open, looking at nothing. Our medic was a woman named Dr. Louise Crane. She had volunteered in 48 hours after the declaration, flying in from a disaster response post in Central Africa where she had spent the last 2 years. She was 47, sharp-tongued, and completely without patience for bureaucratic delays, which made her one of the most useful people I had ever worked with. She walked into that cave, took one long look around, and immediately began reorganizing her team. She did not wait for my authorization. She just started. I watched her crouch down beside an elderly Velhari and begin the slow, careful work of figuring out what he needed, using a combination of the translator implant, hand gestures, and what I can only describe as a particular quality of patience that some people are born with and some earn the hard way. His light flickered when she touched his hand, not much, but it flickered. The evacuation was not clean. Nothing about it resembled the smooth, choreographed operations I had seen in military briefings. It was exhausting and slow and full of small disasters. A cargo hauler's loading ramp jammed 3 times in the first day. One of our volunteer engineers, a young man named Perry Simmons from Auckland, who had signed up believing this would be a humanitarian mission and was still deciding how he felt about the reality of it, fixed the ramp each time with a calm focus that impressed everyone. A Velhari child stopped moving halfway up a boarding ramp and would not walk any further. Nobody could determine why at first. It took our interpreter trainee, a 26-year-old woman named Celeste Morgan, who had studied xenolinguistics at university and had never in her academic career expected to actually use it. 20 minutes of careful observation to realize that the child was watching the sky. Just watching it, unable to stop watching it. Celeste sat down on the ramp beside the child and watched the sky with her until the child's light shifted from gray to something warmer, and then they walked up the ramp together. I do not tell that story to be sentimental. I tell it because it was one of about 100 moments in those first 48 hours that made me understand how little of this work was logistical. On the second day, the Keth sent a warning vessel, not one of the 3 in orbit. A 4th ship, Sleeker, clearly designed for speed, which moved to within 200 kilometers of our frigate and broadcast a message directly to me. Delegate Marin. The translator implant gave the voice a flat bureaucratic quality. Your presence in this zone has been noted as a diplomatic intrusion. You are advised to vacate the area within 72 hours or be formally designated a hostile actor under Keth Dominion territorial law. The Keth Dominion does not recognize Earth's Protection Declaration as valid under Standing Conclave statute. We are communicating this as a courtesy. There was a pause then. Please make a wise decision. I drafted my response carefully. It was 14 pages long. It cited 11 different conclave legal precedents, 3 standing conventions on civilian protection, and 1 treaty that the Keth had signed 200 years ago and clearly assumed everyone had forgotten about. I knew it would not stop them, but I also knew that every formal legal challenge filed was another entry in the permanent record, and permanent records have a way of becoming important later. I sent the 14-page response and bought us 72 hours. On the second night, when most of the camp was quiet and the loading schedule had paused until morning, I walked through the cave complex alone. I had a torch, but I turned it off after a while. The Velhari's ambient light was enough to see by if you let your eyes adjust. Soft blues and greens. Here and there a pulse of warmer gold from a child who had fallen asleep and was dreaming something better than their waking life. I moved carefully, not wanting to disturb anyone. I was not sure what I was looking for. Near the back of the deepest chamber, sitting alone and upright, was an elderly Velhari woman. I had seen her on the first day, moving through the crowd with a quiet authority that made others move for her without being told. She was the closest thing the survivors had to a community elder. Celeste had managed a few exchanges with her, and had told me her name was a complex light pattern that the implant translated only approximately, rendering it as something close to deep river or one who carries current. We had been calling her Lumen privately, because it was easier than explaining the translation problem every time. Lumen looked at me as I approached. Her light was steady, not bright, but steady, which in the context of everything around me felt significant. I sat down a few feet away and did not speak. I did not have the right words in any language. She regarded me for a long time with eyes that were very dark and very clear. Then she reached out one hand and placed it briefly on my forearm. Just for a moment. Just light pressure. And then she withdrew it. Her light shifted when she did it. Just a fraction. A single pulse of something that might have been amber. I did not fully understand what it meant. I still don't, not entirely. But I remembered that it happened, and I held it carefully in my mind during everything that came after. On day 3, a message came through the Conclave's private diplomatic channel. Not a public transmission. A narrow-beam private signal addressed specifically to me. The sender was the Ron Collective's junior diplomatic liaison, a being named Seath who I had met twice at formal dinners and who had always been precise and careful with language. Delegate Marin, the message said, I am communicating outside official channels and without the authorization of my senior delegates. What I am about to tell you is not an offer of assistance. The Ron Collective will not act in this matter. I want to be clear about that. What I am offering is information, because information does not require a vote. There was a pause in the recording. The Keth Dominion and the Vorath Pact have been in a state of covert diplomatic strain for the past 18 months over resource rights in the Quran expanse. 3 of the Keth's most powerful conclave allies are currently unwilling to publicly support any Keth action that generates significant interstellar attention. The Keth are strong, but they are not at this moment invulnerable to scrutiny. A sustained and visible record of their actions here would cost them more than they currently estimate. Another pause. We wanted you to know. We cannot do more, but we wanted you to know the message ended. I played it 3 times. I thought about 47 abstentions. I thought about what that word meant, really meant, when you stripped away the procedural language. Abstain did not mean I do not care. In some cases it meant I care but I am afraid, and fear, unlike indifference, could shift. I was starting to understand that the galaxy was not watching us with contempt, or not only with contempt. Some of it was watching us the way people watch someone do the thing they wish they had the courage to do themselves. That realization did not make me less tired. It did not make the loading ramps jam any less frequently, or make the Keth fleet any less present in the sky above us. But it changed the shape of what I thought we were doing. We were not just saving 14,000 people. We were doing something in front of an audience that had forgotten what it looked like to try. On the last day of evacuation, with the final group of Velhari survivors loading onto the last cargo hauler, the Keth fleet moved, not toward us, toward the empty southern continent, where the Velhari had not been for days. They resumed bombardment of a ghost town, methodical, thorough, making sure. I watched it from the frigate's observation deck. I did not look away. I had decided early on that I was going to look at the things I was responsible for witnessing. That if I was going to stand in chambers and make declarations on behalf of a species that had not asked for my help, the least I could do was see what those declarations were made against. Declan found me there and stood beside me for a while without speaking. Last hauler just cleared atmosphere, he said eventually. Good, I said, we should go. Yes. I looked at Velshan one more time. Green, brown, and gold, scarred now across the northern half, smoke visible even from orbit. A living planet that had been reduced to a problem someone needed to clean up. 2 million people, reduced to a statistic that the Keth's legal department would eventually reclassify as collateral adjustment. 14,211 people were currently in the cargo holds of 4 repurposed Earth haulers, moving toward a future that did not yet exist in any legal or political framework. They were alive. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, the only thing that mattered. Let's go home, I said. Declan gave the order. The frigate turned, and we left the Velshan corridor with the Keth fleet watching, and the 47 silent civilizations of the Conclave watching, and I sat down in the briefing room and began writing the letter I would need to send to Earth's Parliament. because in approximately 11 hours we were going to arrive in home space with 14,000 alien refugees, no legal framework to house them, and a diplomatic crisis that was only just beginning. I poured a cup of cold coffee. I started typing. I had a lot to say. Back home, half the news feeds were calling me a hero. The other half were calling me reckless, naive, and dangerously sentimental. A political columnist I had never heard of wrote a very long piece arguing that I had single-handedly damaged Earth's hard-won position in the conclave for the sake of what he called an emotional gesture toward an irrelevant species. He used the phrase irrelevant species 3 times in the same article. I read it once and then put my phone face down on the table. The Velhari were settled in a temporary refuge station that Earth's Orbital Infrastructure Agency had assembled in the L4 point, roughly 60 degrees ahead of Earth in its orbit around the Sun. It was not glamorous. 4 connected habitat modules designed originally for long-duration research crews, expanded as quickly as possible with additional pressurized compartments. It was cramped and the lighting was wrong for beings whose emotional state was directly tied to the quality of light around them, and the food situation required weeks of careful adjustment before anything resembling a nutritionally appropriate diet could be established. But it was warm, it was pressurized, it had gravity, and it was critically between the Keth Dominion and absolutely nothing, because Earth's government had quietly placed 2 patrol ships in the area without announcing it as a military deployment. I visited the station as often as I could manage. My schedule was mostly not manageable during those first 3 months. Between the parliamentary hearings, the conclave communications, the press requests I mostly declined, and the daily operational needs of managing a refugee population with no legal status and no functioning political representation, I was sleeping about 4 hours a night and eating whatever was nearest to my hand. I was not at my best. I was functioning. Lumen's light was still dim when I visited, not gray the way it had been in the cave. More of a muted blue-green, the color of still water in the early morning. The station's xenopsychology consultant, a quiet man named Dr. Oliver Mace, who had spent 12 years studying bioluminescent communication in aquatic Earth species before pivoting to xenobiology when the conclave opened, told me that the Velhari's light levels were a direct and involuntary expression of emotional state. You could not fake brightness. You could not force warmth. The light came from somewhere inside them that had nothing to do with conscious control, which meant that the dim, muted glow of 14,000 Velhari survivors told you, without ambiguity, exactly what those 14,000 people were living with every day. I sat with Lumen during my visits, and we talked in the way that 2 people talk when they do not share a language, slowly, with patience, with a lot of space for misunderstanding and correction. Celeste translated when she could, but the implant's coverage of the Velhari's light-based communication was still incomplete, and there were entire registers of meaning that simply had no equivalent in any human language the implant had been trained on. We got along anyway. Sums do not require translation, the direction of attention, the quality of stillness, whether someone is with you or merely near you. During my 3rd month home, the Keth Dominion filed its formal sanctions against Earth. The package was substantial. Trade embargoes on 12 categories of goods that Earth had only recently gained access to through conclave membership. Blocked transit lanes through 2 strategic corridors that our shipping companies used heavily. A travel ban affecting 47 individual Earth citizens, most of them diplomatic staff. And a formal complaint to the Conclave's Arbitration Committee citing Earth's declaration as an illegal interference in Keth territorial operations. I read the sanctions document in one sitting. It was 340 pages. I made notes in the margins. The economic effects were not abstract. Earth's interstellar trade network was young and not yet robust enough to absorb a major disruption without real consequences. Prices on certain imported materials rose sharply within weeks. 2 manufacturing sectors that had recently restructured around conclave supplied components found themselves scrambling for alternatives. The unemployment figures, when they came in, were not catastrophic, but they were real. Real people in real cities found their situations harder because of a decision I had made alone in a chamber on the other side of the galaxy. I did not pretend otherwise. I said so plainly in every interview I gave, of which there were many. I said I believed the decision was right. I said I understood it had a cost. I said both things were true at the same time, and that the second did not cancel the first. Director Hartley called me into his office on a Tuesday morning, in what had become a recurring pattern of meetings that were ostensibly about updates, and were actually about giving me an opportunity to change my position. He was a decent man, Owen Hartley. He had backed the mission even when he had not been consulted, which had cost him political capital he was still paying off. He was not angry with me. He was tired, the way people get tired when they are trying to hold something together with not quite enough material. There is a proposal, he said. Without preamble, he slid a document across the desk. I looked at it. Who wrote this? I asked. A joint committee. 7 members of parliament from 3 different parties. It has been kept quiet. I read the first page. The proposal involved transferring the Velhari survivors to a Keth-administered resettlement facility in the Outer Dominion territories. It was framed carefully. The language was about stability and appropriate resources and long-term welfare. The word custody did not appear anywhere in the document. I read it twice to be sure. This is a transfer of custody to the people who destroyed their world, I said. The framing is resettlement, said Hartley. The framing is wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Asha, the sanctions are hurting people. People who did not sign up for this. People who did not vote on it. I understand what you believe and I understand why. But you are not the only person who has to live with the consequences of that decision. I know that, I said. I have known that since the day I made it. But what you are asking me to consider is handing 14,000 people back to the group that spent 6 months systematically destroying their civilization. You can call it resettlement. It is not resettlement. He looked at the window. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had made peace with several things in his career and was not sure he had the energy to refuse to make peace with one more. The committee vote is in 12 days, he said. I am not asking you to endorse it. I am telling you it exists. I nodded. I left the office. I took the long way back to my workspace, through the building's ground floor where there was a courtyard with a few trees in it, because I needed to breathe outdoor air for a moment before I could function again. My personal phone buzzed. A message from Nathan Briggs, my partner of 4 years, asking if I was coming home for dinner. I had been coming home after midnight most nights. We had been having a specific set of conversations, repeated in different forms, that all contained the same core question: whether I was capable of being present in my own life, whether there was a version of me that existed outside of the work, whether he was, in any real sense, a priority. I typed back that I would try. I knew what try meant by that point. He probably knew too. I stood under the trees and looked at the sky for a minute. Earth sky, blue and familiar, and full of clouds. Somewhere up there, past all of it, 14,000 people were living in a repurposed research station, under fluorescent lights that were completely wrong for their biology, and a committee of 7 was quietly drafting the paperwork to send them somewhere from which they would not come back. I went back to my desk and started building a case. The Ron's tip had given me a direction. I spent the next 3 weeks doing something that was technically within my diplomatic mandate, but practically unprecedented. I filed a comprehensive historical grievance report with the Conclave's Arbitration Committee, documenting every Keth Treaty violation in the public record going back 203 years. There were 41 of them. Some were minor. Some were not. 3 involved situations very similar to what had happened at Velshan, settled quietly and expensively. The records buried under layers of procedural reclassification. I submitted the report. I notified the press. I sent copies to every conclave delegate directly. Nobody acted. No emergency sessions were called. No Keth ambassador was summoned. The conclave's response was a formal acknowledgement of receipt and a timeline for preliminary review that extended approximately 2 years into the future, but the record existed now. It was in the archive, permanent, indexed, searchable. The galaxy could look at it any time it wanted. I also, during those 3 weeks, lost Nathan. Not in a single dramatic conversation, but in a gradual, honest way that was in some ways harder. He was not cruel about it. He was clear. He said that he loved me. He said that he also needed to be with someone who could sometimes choose small things over large ones, and that he was not sure I was capable of it, and that he was not sure it was even something he should want to change about me. He said that last part more gently than I deserved, given how many dinners I had missed. I told him I understood. I told him I was sorry. I meant both things completely. The apartment was very quiet for a while after that. I worked longer hours. I told myself it was because there was a lot to do, which was true. I also told myself I was fine, which was less true, but which served its purpose. The committee vote came in on a Thursday. The proposal passed by a margin of 4-3. I had 1 night to act before the parliamentary order became enforceable. I did not sleep. I sat at my desk with my phone and my communications terminal, and a very large amount of cold coffee, and I thought about what leverage I actually had and what I was actually willing to do with it. I thought about Lumen's hand on my arm in the dark of the cave, the single pulse of amber. By morning I had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan. It was the kind of plan that could end my career, and would certainly end my current relationship with the Parliament, which was already strained. It was also, as far as I could determine, the only option available. I pulled up my communications terminal and began drafting a broadcast. I had 1 open communications channel, 1 ship on standby, 14,000 people who were 3 hours away from being formally transferred back, into the hands of the people who had destroyed everything they had ever known, and 6 hours before the parliamentary order became enforceable under conclave statute. I did the most human thing I could think of. I made a lot of calls, and then I went on every frequency I had access to and I told the truth. The broadcast went out at 0600 Earth time. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of polished diplomatic statement that gets reviewed by legal teams and communications consultants and senior advisors before release. It was just me at my desk reading from a file. I read the Keth Violations Archive, all 41 entries. I read the mission report from Velshan in full, including the casualty estimates and the before and after survey data. I read the parliamentary committee proposal, and I explained, clearly and without embellishment, what it would actually mean for the Velhari if it was carried out. I read my own original declaration from the conclave chamber, and then I read the statement that Lumen had given, through Celeste, on her second week in the station. It had taken them 3 sessions to translate it fully. It was 4 sentences long. We did not ask to be saved, it said. We did not know that anyone would come. We had stopped believing that anyone outside our world knew we were real. We know now. I read those 4 sentences and then I stopped the broadcast and sat back in my chair. The response was not immediate. Diplomacy is never immediate. But it started within 2 hours, and once it started, it did not stop. 7 species filed formal objections to the parliamentary proposal with the conclave's legal body within the first day, not military objections, paperwork. The Ron Collective, which had told me it could not act, filed a request for a suspension of any action pending review of the Violations Archive. The Chorus of Dial issued a joint statement. The Varathi delegate, old as stone, the one who had spoken so beautifully about the cost of conflict before voting to do nothing, submitted a request that the Velhari be granted provisional sanctuary status under an obscure clause in the conclave's foundational charter. It was a clause that had not been invoked in over a century, but it existed, and it was legally sufficient. The parliamentary order was suspended pending review. The transfer did not happen. I called Director Hartley at 0800. He answered on the first ring. You went around me, he said. I did. You went around the entire government. I did. A pause. Was it worth it? I thought about 14,000 lights in the dark of a cave. I thought about a child watching the sky from a loading ramp. I thought about Lumen's amber pulse. Yes, I said. He made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh. Clean up your desk, he said. You have a conclave session in 4 days, and you need to not look like you have been awake for 40 hours. I have been awake for 40 hours. Then sleep first. Clean up your desk after. He hung up. I put my phone down and leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for approximately 30 seconds. Which was all the time I had before the next thing began. The Keth response came 48 hours later. It was not what I expected. There was no formal diplomatic communication, no updated legal filing. Instead, a Keth warship entered Earth's solar system at 1400 hours on a Wednesday. Not near Earth, not in any threatening orbital position. It simply moved to a point approximately 4 million kilometers from the Velhari station and stopped there. No weapons charged. No communication broadcast, just presence. A reminder I understood the message. It was precise and efficient and had nothing to do with actual intent to engage. This was not a battle formation. It was a statement. The Keth were reminding us that they were large and we were small, and that international paperwork had not changed that fundamental fact. What happened next was not something I organized. I want to be clear about that, because people have since described it in ways that make it sound like a planned strategy, a coordinated response, a calculated move in a carefully arranged game. It was not any of those things. It was people. Just people, doing the most human thing available to them when they saw a problem. Within 24 hours of the Keth warship's arrival, 14 independent Earth vessels had quietly repositioned themselves between the Keth ship and the Velhari station. They were not military vessels. There was a cargo hauler owned by a family shipping company out of Cape Town. There was a research vessel from the European Space Agency that had been conducting an observatory mission in the outer system. There was the retired colony transport named the Harbor Light that had been in service for over 30 years and had been technically decommissioned 2 years ago but was still crewed by its original team who refused to let her go dark. There was a journalist shuttle. There were 2 commercial survey ships. There was a yacht owned by a man named George Whitfield who had made a large amount of money in materials processing and had absolutely no military training but apparently had very strong feelings about what the Keth were communicating. No weapons, no orders, no coordination beyond the fact that they had all seen the same thing and made the same decision. 14 civilian vessels formed a loose, ragged, unarmed line between a Tier 1 military power and 14,000 people who had nowhere else to go. Declan found me in the operations center when the reports started coming in. He stood beside me and looked at the display showing the vessel positions. He did not say anything for a moment. "The harbor light," he said finally. "She's been decommissioned. I know. Her skipper is a woman named Frances Cole. She is 63 years old. She flew that ship for 28 years. She did not ask for authorization, no," I said. "She did not." He was quiet again. "Do you know what the Keth can't do here?" "Tell me." "They cannot fire on an unarmed civilian vessel without triggering the full weight of the non-combatant engagement clause under conclave law. Not with the violations archive already in the record. Not with 7 species already watching. They would spend the next 30 years in arbitration." He paused. "They know that." "Yes," I said, "they do. We watched the display. The Keth warship did not move for 18 hours. It did not communicate. It did not advance. And then very quietly, it turned and began moving back toward the outer system. No announcement. No statement. No formal acknowledgement that anything had happened. It simply left. I watched it go on the display until it passed beyond our sensor range. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for about 3 months. The Velhari station's lights were visible from Earth that night, not the habitat module lights. The Velhari themselves. All 14,000 of them, pressed against the viewports of the station, their bioluminescence blazing at a brightness none of our staff had ever seen from them before. Celeste later told me that in Velhari light language, that particular quality of light, that full-body radiance coming from an entire community simultaneously, had a specific word. It did not translate into any human language precisely. The closest approximation, Celeste said, was something between remembered and still here. People on Earth's surface saw the light with naked eyes. It made the news. There was footage of a family in New Zealand standing in their garden. Looking up, one of the children asking what that light was. The parent, without hesitation, said, "Those are people who are safe." I was not there to see it. I was in the operations center, still working, writing the 17 messages I needed to send before morning. But Celeste sent me the footage later, and I watched it once, and then I put it away somewhere safe in my memory, in the specific compartment I kept for things I wanted to be able to find again on difficult days. There were still difficult days coming. The Velhari situation was not resolved. The parliamentary committee was not done. The Keth were not suddenly cooperative. The sanctions were not lifted. Everything that needed to be dealt with still needed to be dealt with. But 14,000 people were alive and blazing with light in a station that was, however imperfectly, home for now. And a 63-year-old ship captain had taken a decommissioned vessel into the space between a warship and the people that warship was meant to intimidate, because she had seen what was happening and had decided that the only available response was to be present. I thought about that a lot in the months that followed. The choice to simply be present. The choice to not look away. The choice to put your body, your ship, your career, your comfort, into the space between a threat and the people it was aimed at, without being ordered to, without any guarantee that it would work. It is not strategy. It is not diplomacy. It does not have a name in any military doctrine I am aware of. I think it might just be what humans do when we are paying attention. The conclave gave Earth a permanent seat 14 months after the Velhari Accord was finally ratified. The official statement from Moderator Voss cited, in the conclave's careful and ancient diplomatic language, demonstrated commitment to conclave principles and notable capacity for interstellar crisis engagement. I read it 3 times and could not find the part that said what had actually happened, which was that a woman in a cold corridor had raised her hand, and a 63-year-old ship captain had refused to let an unarmed population be threatened without a witness. The official language was much more formal than that. It usually is. The permanent seat came with a proper office in the conclave building, a full diplomatic delegation of 7, a communications budget that did not require quarterly justification, and a nameplate on the chamber table that said Earth in 7 scripts. I touched the nameplate on the first day and then stood there for a moment feeling the weight of it. Not pride exactly. Something more complicated. The awareness that the nameplate was made possible by a decision that had cost people things they had not agreed to lose, and that carrying it correctly required remembering that. Director Hartley had retired 3 months earlier, quietly and without ceremony, citing health reasons that were real but not the whole story. I had lunch with him before he left. We sat in a restaurant near the government building that had been there for 40 years, the kind of place with paper menus and staff who remembered your order. He ate soup. I ate something I could not identify later because I had been mostly talking. "Are you happy?" he asked at some point, with the directness that he allowed himself, now that he was no longer officially my superior. I thought about it. "I am not sure happy is the right word," I said. "I am very busy." He laughed. It was a good laugh. "That is not an answer, I know." He stirred his soup. "You did something real," he said. "That is rarer than it sounds." I carried that with me. The Velhari Accord. negotiated over 8 months of careful and occasionally exhausting diplomatic work, established a formal protected status for the Velhari survivors under conclave law. It recognized the Velhari as a sovereign people with a right of return to a homeworld. Velshant itself was, by then, a stripped and partially terraformed rock, uninhabitable, without significant environmental work that would take decades. But the right of return was on record, legally enshrined, permanent, and in the interim, a new world had been found and provisionally allocated, smaller than Velshan, different, but alive with water and atmosphere and the right quality of light. The world was named Velnara in the Velhari's own language. It meant approximately Second River. I attended the first planting ceremony on Velanara. It was not an official diplomatic visit. I went because Celeste sent me an invitation that she had spent 2 weeks arranging through the Velhari Community Council, and because I could not have not gone. The ceremony involved placing the first cultivated seeds into the new soil, a ritual that in Velhari culture carried deep meaning related to continuation, to the idea that what was planted outlasts the hand that planted it. Lumen performed the ceremony. She was, by the community's estimation, their eldest surviving elder, and she moved with the careful steadiness of someone who has been carrying a great deal for a long time, and has decided to keep carrying it. Her light was bright, not the explosive full radiance of the night on the station, but a steady, deep, warm green that felt like something that had been found rather than performed. She spoke during the ceremony in her light language, and Celeste translated quietly beside me, and the words were about roots and continuation, and the strange generosity of ground that does not ask who you were before you arrived. After the ceremony, Lumen came to where I was standing. She looked at me with those very dark, very clear eyes. She reached out and took my hand, and she pressed her palm flat against mine, and she held it there for a moment, and her light when she did it was the warmest gold I had ever seen from her. Through the implant, Celeste translated the light phrase she produced. The translation was approximate, as always. The approximate meaning was, I carry your light. I did not have anything to say. There are moments when language is completely the wrong tool. I pressed her hand back. She looked at me for a moment more, and then she turned and walked back to her people, and her light was steady all the way. I stood there for a while after she left. The sky on Velanara was a different color than Earth's, a kind of pale amber in the afternoon, like old honey, with clouds that moved more slowly than I was used to. The air smelled like soil and something green and new. 14,000 people were scattered across the landscape around me, beginning the work of learning a new world, planting seeds in ground that had never known them before. I thought about the conclave chamber, the 47 chimes, my hand going up. I thought about George Whitfield in his yacht and Francis Cole on the Harbor Light and Perry Simmons fixing a cargo ramp 3 times in a single day, with absolute calm, and Celeste sitting down on a loading ramp to watch the sky with a child who could not stop watching it. I thought about the 7 species whose formal paperwork had come through in time to stop a parliamentary order. I thought about Seath from the Ron Collective, sending an unauthorized narrow beam message because they could not act but they could bear witness, and witness matters. I thought about Nathan, who was doing well. We had lunch occasionally. It was fine. We were fine. Some things end without bitterness, and that is a gift worth acknowledging. The difficult days were not over. They never fully are. The Keth were still present in conclave proceedings, still pushing, still filing objections to the permanent Velhari status. 3 of the 7 species who had filed formal objections during the crisis had since quietly distanced themselves from their own positions under Keth diplomatic pressure. The violations archive was still in review, 2 years on, with no resolution timeline. Earth sanctions had been partially lifted through a separate agreement that had cost us 2 years of painful negotiation and several concessions I did not love but had agreed to because the full picture required it. The work was not finished. The work is never finished. On my first day in the permanent seat, a new delegate approached me after the session. She was young. Younger than I had been when I first came to the conclave, which seemed improbable but was apparently possible. She was one of Earth's 7 new permanent delegation members, fresh from the diplomatic academy, still in the phase where everything in the chamber looked simultaneously overwhelming and thrilling. Her name was Maya Ford, and she had the kind of careful, observant eyes that would serve her well in that room. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "The Velhari situation, the original declaration, when you made it." She paused, choosing her words. "What was the strategy? How did you know it would lead where it did?" I looked at her. She was waiting for the answer that would help her understand the logic, the calculus, the professional framework that made the outcome possible. She wanted the lesson that would prepare her for the moment when she might have to do something similar. I told her the truth. "I did not know," I said. "I did not have a strategy. I had a photograph of a village that existed in the morning and did not exist by afternoon. And I had a vote that had just gone 47-0 in the wrong direction, and I had a hand that went up before I had finished deciding to raise it. She thought about that. That does not sound very safe. It was not, but it worked. Partly, I said. Enough, not completely. The work is ongoing. I looked at the nameplate on the table. We are a young species. We have not learned yet what to be afraid of. Sometimes that creates problems. Sometimes it is the only thing that moves anything. She nodded slowly. I could see her filing it away somewhere. In whatever compartment she kept things she needed to think about further. The session was called back to order. We took our seats. I looked around the chamber at 47 other species, ancient and patient and cautious, carrying the weight of long experience, and all the things that long experience teaches you to stop attempting. I thought about what it costs to be old, in that particular way. The things you stop reaching for because you know how far they are. The agenda for the day was moving through its standard items, routine matters, trade protocols, survey rights, procedural reviews, and then, near the end of the scheduled items, a new entry had been added that morning. A flag had come in overnight from a monitoring station near the Oran system. A small population, the report said, non-combatant, no standing military treaty, no conclave representation, located in a contested resource corridor. The flag was procedural, the kind that asked whether the conclave wished to formally designate the situation as a matter of concern. The chamber read the flag in silence. I watched the delegates read it. I watched their eyes. Some of them looked at the floor. Some of them looked at each other. Some of them looked at nothing in particular with the practiced neutrality of beings, who have decided many times over the course of many years that neutrality is a form of safety. Moderator Voss began to speak. The item before the chamber regarding the Oran system population flag. Does any delegate wish to? I raised my hand. The chamber went quiet in a way I recognized now. Not the dismissive quiet of the first time. Something different, attentive. Several delegates turned to look. The Ron ambassador turned to look. Even the Keth delegate turned, slowly, and looked at me from across the chamber with those copper-colored eyes. I did not look away from Moderator Voss. Earth recognizes the floor, I said. There was a pause, then Moderator Voss very carefully nodded. Delegate Marin. I thought briefly about what this was going to cost. I thought about it clearly and without flinching. The way you have to think about a cost if you are going to carry it honestly. Then I put the thought away and I spoke. They still called us the youngest species in the conclave. 3 years ago, I heard that as a measure of how seriously we were taken. Now I heard it differently. Youth means you have not yet learned all the reasons not to try. Youth means you still believe the vote matters, that the record matters, that the hand you raise in an empty room matters even when no one raises it with you. Youth means you have not yet been taught the particular kind of tiredness that looks like wisdom but is actually just the long accumulation of surrendered possibilities. I was not interested in that kind of wisdom. The Oran system population waited somewhere in the dark between the stars, not knowing that anyone was about to argue on their behalf, not knowing that a young species with a new nameplate and a history of making inconvenient choices had just decided that their existence was a matter of record, of conscience, and of the specific, stubborn, incurable human belief that the right answer is still the right answer even when it is the hard one. I took a breath. I kept going.